Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 215. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of The Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm chatting with author Brian J. Morra about his new Able Archer series. The first two books, The Able Archers and The Righteous Arrows, are available now. The Able Archer series is a work of historical fiction based on certain real-life events in the 1980s, in particular, the Soviet nuclear crisis in 1983 and the Soviet Union's brutal war in Afghanistan. The protagonist in the series, CIA officer Kevin Cattani, is inspired by Brian's own experiences as a former U.S. intelligence officer during that period. Cattani's Soviet counterpart, Ivan Levchenko, is based on Brian's own memories of various KGB and GRU officers, many of whom defected from the Soviet Union. Written as a thriller, the series begins with the end of the détente between the U.S. and Soviet Union in the early 80s that put both countries on a collision course for confrontation. That period of time has been described as one of the most dangerous in human history. In this episode, I'll chat with Brian about his writing journey, the very personal meaning behind the name of his main character, and his plans for the rest of the series, which may include such events as the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Persian Gulf War, as well as a few other things coming up. Brian J. Morra, thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Well, thank you very much, Stacey, and thank you for the invitation. Happy to be with you.
I thought what we could do today is talk about your new series, the Able Archer series. What I'd like to do, since you have two books in this series that are out and available, I'd like to talk about this series in general. So if you don't mind, maybe give us an overview of this series, and let's talk about the inspiration for you when you started writing it.
Sure. Yes. Well, I'm happy to do that. The Able Archer series, and as you said, there are two books that have been released. It takes place during the late Cold War period, which is a period that, interestingly, a lot of people don't really know that much about, but it covers the decade of the 1980s and actually into the 1990s, the immediate post-Cold War era. The motivation that I had in writing the first book, and I guess that's a good place to start, the first book is called The Able Archers, and it is about, in general, the 1983 Soviet nuclear war crisis, which almost no one knows about, but which is just as important in many ways and just as dangerous in many ways as the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. So part of my motivation in bringing the Able Archers to life was to entertain, of course, but also to educate people through an historical fiction lens about that 1983 crisis and how it has reverberations really to the present day, particularly with regard to the war in Ukraine and Russian threats about the use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. So that was the initial motivation behind the series. And I should also point out that the series is heavily influenced by my own personal experience. And in the case of the Able Archers, I was a participant in many of the key events of that 1983 nuclear war crisis. And throughout the series, I really pivot off my own personal experience as an intelligence officer to try to personalize the experience for the reader and make it, not as cold and factual as a nonfiction book, but something that has characters, including the character who is based on me, that people can relate to.
Let's talk about the characters. Let's start with the one that people may associate with you, but I'd like to talk about both of them in turn, if you don't mind.
Yeah, oh, happy to do it. Well, the character who is based more or less on me and my experience, his name is Kevin Cattani, and I chose that name purposefully. My own name, Brian Morra, is a Celtic first name and an Italian last name. So I wanted to give Kevin the same treatment. So Kevin is a Celtic name, and he's actually, the first name Kevin comes from a first cousin of mine who died very young, and he and I were very close when we were young people. The last name Cattani is also a family name. It comes from my paternal grandmother. It was her maiden name. So Kevin Cattani is based on me and my experiences, but also what I do with Kevin is I blend into his world of experience things that happened to other people that I knew. So Kevin's not a one for one representation of my experience. He's more representative of me plus the experiences of other intelligence officers that I worked with during the 1980s. The other character, Kevin's alter ego, his opposite number really, is named Ivan Levchenko. And Levchenko is Russian, and his profession is that he is a Soviet military intelligence officer. And the abbreviation for that in Russian is GRU. And some of our listeners may be familiar with that abbreviation from coverage of the war in Ukraine, where Russia also uses that same abbreviation, GRU, for Russian military intelligence. Ivan Levchenko is a composite born from my memories of KGB and GRU officers, mainly defectors, that I knew in the 1980s. And what I wanted to do with Levchenko as a character is make him relatable and make him not a stereotypical ogre. He's not a bad guy. I wanted to bring together the best traits of those Russian officers that I knew back in the 1980s and blend them into this melange that becomes Ivan Levchenko. So Levchenko is kind of my ideal of a Soviet GRU officer of the day, very highly educated, very sophisticated, multilingual, and so on. And he's older than Kevin Cattani during these books. He's about 20, close to 20 years older than Kevin is. And so he's much farther along in his career. And he's married, has a wife that he adores, and he's just in a different place in his life than Cattani is. And that's part of the dynamic that arises between the two men.
Let's talk about the setting in which these characters reside. So, for probably a number of listeners, they remember the Cold War of the 1980s. But there are a vast number of readers out there that don't remember that, weren't alive during that time. So, can you brief us a little bit on the setting? What should readers keep in mind about that particular time period?
Yes, the first half of the 1980s, for example, and again, the Able Archer starts about 1980, even though its focus is on the year 1983, because that's when the big nuclear war crisis occurred. Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the last president of the Soviet Union, called that first half of the 1980s the most dangerous period in all of human history. And he called it that because we nearly went to nuclear war in 1983, the United States and the Soviet Union. And had we gone to war at that time, humanity as we know it would never have been the same. There are some who argue that if there had been a general nuclear war at that time, humanity would have become extinct, if not immediately, within a few years after the war. And the reason for that is that by 1983, by the mid 1980s, the US and the Soviet Union had enormous nuclear arsenals, much, much larger than they are today, for example. And they had the capacity to wreak just unimaginable destruction on the world. And so that's part of the setting for these books, is this specter of nuclear war, of a catastrophic nuclear war, kind of hung over the world. And by the early 1980s, Ronald Reagan was president of the United States. He was inaugurated in January of 1981, and he was elected partly on a platform of being very anti-communist, being very anti-Soviet. And he did not believe in détente. And détente was a lessening of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union that had occurred from about 1969 to about 1980. And Reagan, for a lot of good reasons, thought that détente was not a good thing for the United States. And actually, by the time Reagan comes to office in 1981, the Soviet leadership had come to the same conclusion on their own, that détente was dead and that confrontation was instead the order of the day between the Soviet Union and the United States. So the atmosphere, the environment was extremely tense and fraught with fear of confrontation that could lead to a devastating and catastrophic nuclear war. So that's the overall backdrop.
For both of these books, The Able Archers, book 1, and The Righteous Arrows, book 2, for both of these, like you said, they're historical fiction. So they are based on actual events. And if readers remember the history or want to look it up, they know the general outcome of these stories. But what you've done for readers is fill in details that most people don't know. And so that's where the mystery and the tension lies in stories like yours, is filling in the gaps and giving readers sort of a behind the scenes peek as to what happened.
Yes, that's exactly correct. And what I wanted to do in these books is put the reader right in the middle of the action. And the literary device I use to do that is through first person narration. And I have dueling first person narrators, Kevin Cattani on the one hand and Ivan Levchenko on the other. So the reader sees these events through the eyes of these two men who are experiencing the events while they're experiencing them. And I often say I want to put the reader right in the room or right in the setting with these guys and have them emotionally connect to what these people are going through as they're going through these life-changing experiences and potentially catastrophic experiences. So that's one aspect of the writing. And you're right, it is all of my books are based on real events. And I also include some features in my books that are more typically found in nonfiction books. I have an historical timeline, for example, that is the real events that readers can refer to in an appendix. And I also have a list of the key characters, which I thought would be helpful for orienting people that are not that accustomed to a lot of Russian names, for example. and helping them, see through who those individuals are and what their roles are. And many of the people that are in the list of key characters are real people. They're real Soviet leaders and officers, and the same is true on the American side. So I've tried to. Some people have even said, it almost reads like nonfiction, but it's exciting nonfiction. It's a story that really grabs you and won't let you go. And that's what I was going for, was this sort of blend of historical fiction written in a thriller type of way, so that it is suspenseful, even though people may ultimately know the outcome of the events. I wanted to keep people on the kind of the edge of their seats as they're reading, wondering, gee, I wonder really how this. Well, I kind of know how this turns out, but it seems like there are lots of cliffhangers in the books as well that are, again, based on real events.
Right, right. How did we get there, and how close did we come?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. I think another motivation, as I said earlier, was to educate with a small e, and get people thinking about these kinds of events and how they relate to the current world situation that we find ourselves in today.
Yeah.
And that there are people today trying to deal with these situations in much the same manner that Kevin Cattani and Ivan Levchenko were dealing with them back in their time.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about each of the books a little bit. Let's start with the Able Archers, because as you mentioned, it deals with the 1983 Soviet nuclear crisis. But what I'd like to discuss maybe is how we got there. So I don't think it's too great a spoiler, maybe, if you kind of set it up for us. Like, what leads these two characters on this collision course with each other?
Yes. Well, as I mentioned earlier, some of the context for, especially for the Able Archers, but also for the rest of the books, is this end of détente and this confrontational stance that the United States and the Soviet Union were taking toward each other. And under President Reagan in particular, the United States took some actions that in the Kremlin were viewed as highly provocative, including in 1983, a major naval exercise in the North Pacific, which went into waters that the Soviets essentially claimed as their own inland seas. And the US Navy acted during that exercise in a highly provocative way, including violating Soviet airspace and sending combat aircraft over Soviet military facilities and doing mock bomb runs. So the US was being very provocative. The Soviets were doing things around the world, and particularly in Central America, in Cuba, and so on, that were also very highly provocative. And the two sides did not trust each other at all. And one distinction between 1983 and the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 that is important is, in 1962, when John Kennedy was president and Khrushchev was the leader in the Soviet Union, Kennedy and Khrushchev talked to each other. They were in almost daily communication during the Cuban Missile Crisis. During 1983, Ronald Reagan and his opposite number in the Soviet Union, a man named Yuri Andropov, were not in communication at all. There was zero communication, which is very similar to the situation today between Moscow and Washington, frankly, between Putin and whoever is in the White House. So one of the scariest things about 1983 is that events were occurring and no one was minding the store, in a sense. And in the fall of 1983, when these events reached a crescendo, the two sides were extremely antagonistic toward each other over what I call the trigger event for the 1983 crisis, which was on the 1st of September 1983. The Soviet Air Force shot down a Korean civilian airliner, a 747, just north of Japan, killing 269 civilians, including 62 Americans. And once that occurred, that was the final straw, in a sense, for Reagan and Andropov. They decided there was no point in having any discussions with the opposite side. And what then occurred during the fall months is that culminating in November of 1983, we nearly stumbled into a general nuclear war, and neither side knew it. Neither side really knew that we were that close to a general nuclear war. Actually, the Soviets were better informed than we were, frankly. And that's a contrast with the 1962 situation over the Cuban missiles, the Soviet missiles in Cuba, where, again, Washington and the Kremlin, they knew what was going on. And it was very public, their diplomacy, their messaging back and forth to each other. Some of it was secret, but much of it was public. And so people knew there was a crisis and knew that Kennedy was trying to diffuse it. In 1983, the White House didn't even know we were in a crisis. And which is the scariest thing, I think, about the Able Archers incident, where we again nearly stumbled into a general nuclear war. And that phrase is one that former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, who was at the time in 1983 Deputy Director of CIA, Gates described the Soviet nuclear war crisis of 83 as we almost stumbled inadvertently into a general nuclear war and didn't really realize it. So that's, I think, the essence of the Able Archers. And in that book, in the Able Archers, Kevin Cattani and Ivan Levchenko come together in November of 83 and meet together in East Germany in an attempt to diffuse this crisis and bring it to a peaceful conclusion. And much of the book details the fits and starts of those efforts to try to bring this to a peaceful conclusion and not blow up the world.
So that's the Able Archers. Readers may have an idea of what happens ultimately in the end, but we'll let them read the book to find out how we get there. But I'd like to turn our attention to the second book in the series, The Righteous Arrow. So you've brought back Kevin Cattani and Ivan Levchenko, and they are once more dealing with another crisis that, as you mentioned before, had reverberations that we feel in present day. So introduce us to this book, if you don't mind. And again, let's talk about how we got into that particular mess.
Yes, well, The Righteous Arrows was just published. It was just released on April 16th of this year. And it mainly concerns a war that many of us have forgotten about, and that is the Soviets' war in Afghanistan. And that war lasted 10 years. The Soviets occupied Afghanistan for a decade. And the United States saw this as an opportunity to weaken the Soviet Union. And Ronald Reagan is still president. Yuri Andropov is no longer in power. He's died, actually, by the time of the major action of the Righteous Arrows, which takes place in 1986. The book, The Righteous Arrows, opens actually just a few months after the Able Archers concludes. And the first part of the book explains how, while it appeared that the crisis ended in November of 1983, we now learn that it didn't quite end, and that Kevin Cattani is still dealing with a Soviet nuclear threat going into 1984. But then the rest of the book does transition to Afghanistan. And what Kevin Cattani sees as he is working with CIA in Pakistan to supply the Islamic rebels who are fighting the Soviets. Cattani is working to supply them with advanced weapons, including surface to air missiles that will take down Soviet aircraft. Cattani becomes unsettled, even somewhat disillusioned by the gap he sees between policymakers in Washington and what he's observing on the ground in Pakistan and Afghanistan. And he's now on the opposite side from Ivan Levchenko. In The Righteous Arrows, Ivan Levchenko's role is that he is commander of all the Soviet GRU, the military intelligence forces, which includes their special operations forces. He's in charge of all of those forces in Afghanistan. And Cattani is supplying weapons to Levchenko's enemies to kill Levchenko's men. So they're these men who collaborated so closely together in 1983 to forestall a nuclear war are now engaged in a proxy war in Afghanistan, where the United States is again seeking to weaken the Soviet Union and also, frankly, to exact revenge against the Soviet Union for its support of North Vietnam during the Vietnam War. And this is a kind of a sub theme of the book that I bring out because I think many Americans are not aware of this, that one of the main motivations we had in trying to hurt the Soviets in Afghanistan was retribution over what the Soviets did to us in Vietnam. To your point about repercussions that we still feel today, one of the reasons for Kevin Cattani's disillusionment in The Righteous Arrows is a warning that Ivan Levchenko gives him at the end of the book. And this warning essentially is that you Americans don't understand what you're doing here, arming Islamic rebels. You're opening Pandora's box and you're releasing forces that you will not be able to control and that will come back to haunt you. Even if they're hurting the Soviet Union today, someday these forces that you're unleashing are going to also hurt you. So that's part of the through line to our own experience, I think, in the post 9/11 world.
I'm curious now, since you've got two books out, what your plans are for the rest of the series. Is it possible that that the Cold War provided you with even more material for further books?
Yes, and it has. And the third book is called The Wall Breakers. It's not available yet. I just sent the manuscript to the publisher a couple of weeks ago. This November is the 35th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And that's what The Wall Breakers is about. It's about the events leading up to and the context of the opening and then the fall of the Berlin Wall, which occurred in 1989. And the publisher tells me we probably won't be able to get the book out, before the anniversary in November of this year, but hopefully it'll come out next winter. And again, Levchenko and Cattani are on opposite sides of the wall, so to speak, literally and figuratively. And you see events through each of their eyes, as you do in each one of the books. But this time you're seeing the crumbling of the Soviet Empire, and you're seeing it through Levchenko's eyes and through Cattani's eyes, and which eventually leads to the fall of the Soviet Union. So that's book 3, and then I'm working assiduously now on book number 4, which is largely set. It's set in 1990 and 91, and it's largely about two major events. One is the Persian Gulf War, also known as Desert Storm, and another event that occurred in 1991, which was the fall of the Soviet Union. And those two events, the Persian Gulf War, the first war in Iraq, and the fall of the Soviet Union, are actually quite related. Those events are related in history, and I'll try to bring that out in this book. So those are the four that are kind of in the hopper, and I've got plans for two or three more books beyond that, but we'll see how far I go into the 1990s. But that's I think what I'll probably do eventually is have the series end at 9/11.
Okay.
I
All
think.
right. Well, that should keep you busy for a while. You've still got a lot
Yeah.
of ground to cover.
Yes, I do.
I would like to ask, since your experience, your background is as a intelligence officer, and you've been drawing on your own experiences in writing these books. I'm curious how the act of writing, the job of being a writer, an author, compares to these experiences that you've had in the past. I imagine in some ways they're not nearly as exciting on a day-to-day basis, but they're probably also a lot less dangerous, the job you're doing today.
Yes, yes, yes. Writing has its own dangers, but most of them are not lethal.
Right.
So, um, it's been fascinating. I mean, I when I started this journey, I when I started writing The Able Archers, I thought initially I would probably write a nonfiction treatment, and for a variety of reasons, I decided to go the historical novel route, and I'm glad I did. I would probably find, knowing my personality, I'd probably find the footnoting and references required for nonfiction to be overwhelmingly tedious.
Yeah.
So, uh, and this way, as a friend of mine said, you're able to bring your perceptions and your personal observations of events into these stories in a way that would not really be appropriate for a nonfiction treatment. So I'm really enjoying that, and I enjoy writing. I've always liked to write. I just started writing fiction though with The Able Archers, and have been fortunate that it's been very well received and won some awards and that sort of thing, which is important for a writer's self-confidence, if nothing else, right? And so I enjoy it a lot, and I love history, and I love the blending of history with personal experience. So it's a real joy for me to write these books. And I must also point out that my wife Tracy is a partner in crime on this. She's my story editor, and I bounce ideas off of her. And she is a voracious reader of fiction. She's very helpful in helping me with story arc and thinking about character development, and particularly female characters, which I haven't mentioned any of those in this discussion, but there are strong and important female characters in these books that are important, not only to Kevin Cattani and Ivan Levchenko, but to the stories themselves.
Well, well done to both you and Tracy. If people want to learn more about you and the books and stay tuned for announcements on new releases, that sort of thing, where can they go to find you and that information?
I have a website, www.brianjmorra.com. That's BrianJMorra.com. And we really put a lot of time and attention into the website. There's more information about me. More importantly, there's more information about the actual historical events that I write about. That we post podcasts like this one and other writing that I do, because I do some editorial writing and some nonfiction writing, and we post that. And there are also links on my website to where you can buy the books at Amazon, bookstore is another one, barnesandnoble.com, booksamillion.com, and so forth. So they're easily accessible there. And the Able Archers is available in all formats, including a really excellent audiobook. And I can say that because I had nothing to do with it. But the audiobook is read by two actors, one American who reads Kevin Cattani's narration and a Russian actor who reads Ivan Levchenko's. And they do a really, really good job. So that's available for the able archers. And then they're available in all the other formats, hard copy and ebooks. The Righteous Arrows, we don't have an audiobook yet. We're working on it, but we don't have that done as yet. So hopefully we'll get that out sometime in the not too terribly distant future. And I also should mention, I think that there's a new Netflix series, documentary series on the Cold War, which is called Turning Point, the Bomb in the Cold War. And it's really, really excellent. It's 9 episodes, and I appear in episode number 5, which concerns the 1983 Soviet nuclear war crisis. So if your listeners have an interest in learning more about the Cold War, I can recommend that. And CNN is coming out with a new series. I should say that the Netflix series just premiered in March, so it's quite new. CNN has a new series starting in June that's called, I think it's called Spy Wars and the Nuclear Age or something along those lines. Sorry for not getting it right, but it's a collaboration between CNN and BBC. And the BBC interviewed me extensively for that. So I haven't seen any of it yet, but hopefully I'll appear in that as well. We'll see. So those are some other places that folks can go, and we are working on a television treatment for a limited TV series for the able archers, and we've had a lot of interest in Hollywood for that. In fact, one of the big production companies took out an option on the able archers. So hopefully someday we'll have the able archers appear as a limited television series.
Very nice. Brian, thank you for joining me today on the podcast. And I want to wish you luck with the Able Archers series. The Able Archers, Book 1, The Righteous Arrows, Book 2, and we'll look forward to 3, 4, and possibly 5, 6, etc. In the not too distant future. So congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far, and best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Thank you very much, Stacy, and it's been a pleasure being with you today. Thank you.
The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published, as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author, or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the Bookshop at the End of the Internet.